Hello, it is Miss Kirk here with one of my favorite things to talk about. Can you guess what we're going to be talking about today? If you guessed voting, you are right. I've got my friend Crew here all dressed up in his best attire so that he can talk with us too about how important it is to vote and how important it is to learn about voting. So that's what we're going to talk about today. To get us started, I have a book I want to share. This is called Grace for President. So let's start with this and then we'll talk more about voting and elections in the United States. Grace for President. One Monday morning in September, Mrs. Barrington rolled out a big poster with all of the president's pictures on it. Grace Campbell could not believe her eyes. Where are all the girls? That is a very good question, said Mrs. Barrington. The truth is, our country has never had a woman president. No girl president ever? Grace asked. No, I'm afraid not, said Mrs. Barrington. Grace sat at her desk and stewed. No girls? Who'd ever heard of such a crazy thing? Finally, she raised her hand. Yes, Grace, I've been thinking it over, and I would like to be president. Several students in the class laughed. Well, I think that's a star-spangled idea, Grace, said Mrs. Barrington. In fact, we can have our very own election right here at Woodrow Wilson Elementary. The snickering in the room stopped. Grace smiled. Would anyone else like to run for president? Mrs. Barrington asked the class. Nobody raised their hand. Becoming president was going to be easy, Grace thought. The next day, Mrs. Barrington made an announcement. In the name of democracy, I have invited Mr. Waller's class to join our election. Their class has nominated Thomas Cobb to be their presidential candidate. Grace's heart sank. Thomas was the school spelling bee champion. His experiments always took a blue ribbon at the science fair, and he was captain of the soccer team. Becoming president wasn't going to be so easy after all, Grace thought. The teachers put the names of all 50 states and the District of Columbia into a hat. Everyone except Grace and Thomas got to choose a state. I'm Texas, said Anthony. I'm New Hampshire, said Rose. I'm Michigan, said Robbie. What does the number 16 mean? Each state is assigned a number of electoral votes. That number is determined by how many people live in that state, said Mrs. Barrington. Each of you will be a representative for your state. Altogether, our country has 538 electoral votes, Mr. Waller explained. On election day, the candidate who receives 270 electoral votes or more wins the election. Why 270? Asked Rose. That's more than half of the electoral votes, Mr. Waller said. Becoming president really wasn't going to be easy, Grace thought. Grace came up with a campaign slogan, Make History, Vote Campbell for President. Thomas came up with his own campaign slogan, Vote for Thomas Cobb, the best man for the job. Grace listened to what issues were important to the students, and she made a list of campaign promises. A peaceful school, no bullies, a cleaner school, no littering, better hot lunches, no more fish stick tacos. Thomas made up his own list of promises. Free tutoring, free soccer lessons, fish dip tacos every week. Grace made campaign posters and buttons. Thomas made posters and buttons too. Each week, the teachers set aside time for the candidates to meet with their constituents. Polls were taken, voters were making their choices. Grace continued to campaign. At recess, she gave speeches. During lunch, she handed out free cupcakes. After school, she held rallies. Meanwhile, Thomas wasn't worried. He had cleverly calculated that the boys held slightly more electoral votes than the girls. So at recess, Thomas studied his spelling words. During lunch, he worked on his latest science experiment. And after school, he played soccer. Even before the election, Grace made good on her promises. She joined the safety squad. She organized a school beautification committee, and she volunteered her time in the school cafeteria. In early November, Woodrow Wilson Elementary hosted a special Election Day assembly. Grace and Thomas took their places on stage as the school band began to play. Henry was the first representative to approach the microphone. The Yellow Hammer State of Alabama cast its 9 electoral votes for Thomas Cobb. Fletcher said, the last frontier state of Alaska casts its 3 electoral votes for the best man for the job, Thomas Cobb. Hannah called out, the Grand Canyon state of Arizona casts its 11 electoral votes for Grace Campbell. And so it went. State after state after state cast their electoral votes. The scoreboard in the gymnasium kept track of all the totals. The voting demonstration was quickly coming to an end. Clara approached the podium. The Badger State of Wisconsin casts its 10 votes for my best friend, Grace Campbell. Grace looked at the scoreboard. Thomas had 268 electoral votes and she had 267. Do you remember how many they need to win? Over 270, so they're both close. Thomas needs 2 more and Grace needs 3 more. There was 1 state left, still unaccounted for. It was the state of Wyoming. Thomas grinned. Grace felt sick. Sam walked up to the microphone. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Grace. He looked down at Grace's handmade flag. Sam didn't say a word. What are you waiting for? Thomas said. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on Wyoming. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. The equality state of Wyoming casts its 3 electoral votes for, drumroll please, Grace Campbell. The gymnasium erupted in loud cheers, and a few boos too. Mrs. Barrington approached the podium. With 270 electoral votes, the winner is Grace Campbell. Thomas looked stunned. Grace hugged Sam. Why did you do it? She asked. Sam handed Grace his flag. Because, he said, I thought you were the best person for the job. The following week, students in Mrs. Barrington's class were prepping for their career day presentations. Grace volunteered to go first. She stood at the front of the room and she glanced at the posters still hanging on the wall. My name is Grace Campbell, and when I grow up, I am going to be president of the United States. This time, everyone believed that she would. The Very good. In our story, Grace was running for president because she was amazed and pretty upset that there had never been a woman president. Look at all those men on the wall, none of them women. And did you know that women haven't even always been able to vote? Yeah, it wasn't until 1920, 100 years ago, that the 19th Amendment allowed women to vote. There was even a time that people that were African American couldn't vote, even African American men. They weren't allowed to vote until 1870. And so there was almost 100 years between 1787, when white men who owned land were able to vote when the Constitution was written, 1787, and then jump all the way to 1870 when black men could vote, and then 1920 when women could vote. So our voting history has a lot of interesting facts and things that make people a little bit upset sometimes, just like Grace was upset that we've never had a woman president. But the good thing about our story and about why it's so important to talk about voting and learn about voting is because you can make a difference. And that's what we want to talk about today. Does anyone know how old you have to be able to vote? Anyone? If you said 18, you are right. 18 years old is how old you have to be to vote in the United States. And some of you might be wondering, that sounds like a long time away. And it might seem like it, but it may not be as long as you think. So I have my handy dandy how many years until I can vote calculator here. And we'll see how long it's going to be until you can vote. So let's see. How many of you guys are currently 6 years old? If you're 6 years old, let's put it through the calculator. How many years until I can vote? Dun, da, da, da. 12. 12 years until you can vote if you're 6. Let's try another one. What about if you're 10 years old? You might already know. Do you know how many years it is until you're 18? If you don't, let's put it through our handy dandy calculator, and 8 years old. So if you're 10 right now, you'll be able to vote in just 8 years, not too far away. What about if you're 5 years old? 5 years old. Let's see what we calculate here. 13 more years until you can vote. All right. Any 8-year-olds out there? All right, let's see how long it'll take you until you can vote. Just 10 more years. You better start practicing now. It's coming up soon. And what about if you are 9 years, 3 months, and 15 days old? It's pretty specific, but if you were born on July 1st of 2011, that's how old you are. So let's go through our calculator, see if it can calculate that really difficult number. Dun, da, da, da. It sure can. You can vote in 8 years, 8 months, and 14 days if you were born on July 1st, 2011. Very good. Do any of you have any young brothers or sisters? Maybe they're not watching this right now, but what if you're just 1 year old right now? How long do you think it'll be until they can vote? Let's put it through. 17 years until they can vote. That's a little bit away, but you can still start talking to them about the importance of voting. And if you want to figure out exactly how many years and days and even hours until you can vote, you can go to birthdaycalculator.com and figure it out, because we all need to be waiting and really excited for that day when we turn 18 and we get to practice our right to vote. It is a really big privilege and a huge responsibility to use our right to vote. So the second you turn 18, it's really important that you start doing that. Right, Crew? Crew wishes he could vote, but they don't let dogs yet, so maybe someday. All right, well, we've talked a lot about voting, so let's talk a little bit more about what an election is like. We heard from Grace about the Electoral College, which is kind of confusing, But the back of our book talks a little bit more about that, and I wanted to share just a little bit about it. Remember, we said you had to have how many of the electoral votes to win? Do you remember the number? It was at least 270, and that's because there's 538 in the whole United States. And so you have to have at least half or more to win the election. You might be wondering how that number for each state is calculated. Did you notice in our story that each state had an odd number? Like Alaska had just 3, Alabama had 9, Arizona had 11. So how that number is calculated is it takes its number of senators plus the number of representatives, and that equals its electoral votes. So for example, in California, they have 2 senators and they have 53 representatives. So California, what's the total of that? 53 plus 2. Yeah, 55. You're exactly right. That's how many electoral votes California has. In fact, California, I believe, has the most of any state because it's a really big state and has a lot of people. So I challenge you to look up how many electoral votes your state has so you can learn a little bit more about your state. So how it works is you have to go and cast your ballot, and then your ballot goes towards your state's total, and whoever gets the most vote in your states, then you get those electoral votes towards that total number trying to get to 270. So your voice matters, and it's important that you cast your vote so that your vote counts. So let me show you what a ballot looks like. This is printed, so it's a pretend ballot, but this is exactly like what the ballot will look like when your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle go to vote this year. And you've probably heard a lot about the presidential candidates, or maybe at least some of them that are running. You might have heard about some of the parties we have in our in the United States. We have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but there's others you maybe haven't heard of as much too. We have the Green Party and the Independent Party and the Libertarian Party too. So I encourage you to look those up too, because it's important that you learn about each of these. On our presidential candidates on the ballot this year, maybe you've heard about some of them, like our current president, Donald Trump, is running again. He's running for a second term, so he's on the ballot. And maybe you've heard about the former vice president, Joe Biden. He's running for president also. They're both on the ballot. But what maybe you didn't know is there are other people on the ballot too. There are other people in those other parties that are running. There's a Libertarian and 3 independent. So it's important that you do your research. You listen to the causes, just like we heard the classmates of Grace would listen to her, what she was going to do, and they would listen to her speeches, and that's how they made their decision. So that's important when we're voting, that we listen to everyone's viewpoints, and then we cast our ballot. We cast our ballot in a voting booth that looks just like this. We get to pick who we want. It's nobody else's business who we vote for. It can be a secret that we only share with ourselves. Then we take our ballot, we put our ballot in our voting box, we get our sticker that proudly says, "I voted." I recognize that it is a privilege and a responsibility to vote every time there's an election to make sure my voice is heard. And when you turn 18, it's important that you do the same. I hope you learned a little bit about how important it is to use your voice and to vote. And I hope that you will practice your right to vote when you turn 18. Have a great day. Bye-bye.